Well, now to our forum. In your programs, you have the complete bios for our two prestigious speakers this afternoon. So please take a look at those bios. I'm going to be very brief here for the sake of our forum and our TV time. Our first speaker is the 10th Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court and the first woman to lead the Ohio Supreme Court. Prior to her election on the bench, she was elected in 1988 as Lieutenant Governor under Governor Bob Taft. Please welcome Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor.
98. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Emmett, for that welcome and for the introduction. One correction, it was 98, not 88. You added 10 years to my age, and that's something you never do. But it's great to be here. Bill and I are grateful to be able to give you our perspectives on the impact of the lack of court funding. I'm going to talk about the impact in Ohio, and Bill will broaden that perspective to the country. And when I became Chief Justice in 2011, I said Ohio must look beyond the immediate financial situation that we find ourselves in as a result of this great recession and examine some long-term solutions to strengthen the financial picture of Ohio courts. The judicial branch needed to pursue systemic change and further cost savings through collaborative process involving Ohio's judges, lawyers, and, of course, all stakeholders in the community. To take this longer view, I established a bipartisan 29-person task force on the funding of Ohio courts to examine our current structure and the funding of the judicial branch. I appointed task force members from a broad representation of judicial groups and legal organizations from all across the state of Ohio. The group's most crucial task is to identify exactly where we are when it comes to the funding of the courts. We must first do this before we can determine where we want to be and how we're going to get there. And quite frankly, we don't know how much it takes to fund the courts in the state of Ohio, on the state, on the local level. But determining where we are will be a challenge because of the way in which the Ohio judicial system is structured and funded. There is no collective dollar amount that can easily be identified that is dedicated to our judicial system here in the state of Ohio. There's state and local money that goes for salaries and operational expenses, as well as court fines and fees and federal grants that are used to various functions. Collectively, no one knows what that dollar amount is. Ohio has a complicated system of multiple interwoven funding sources that varies depending on locality. The group has set out to tackle that question first. How much are we talking about? How much money is spent on maintaining the judicial system here in the state of Ohio? By concentrating on that first, we will be well on our way. To that end, the task force and the Supreme Court staff are currently considering a survey that will go out to all of the local entities to collect information on the funding of the state courts, such as figuring out how much funding local courts receive from various sources. But in addition to all that is the important question, which is the flip side. How much money is received or collected by the judicial system? And what are those dollars earmarked for? What exactly are their purposes? Equally as important to answer is how much is generated by courts in fines and fees. Those are the overarching questions to answer, but there are still some specific issues to address in addition to that. Number one, identifying the method and manner by which Ohio courts are funded, determining the long-term efficacy of the current funding models. Will this model stand us in good stead in the years coming forward? And reviewing possible alternatives that might provide sustained and consistent funding here in the state of Ohio. A thorough examination of how the court system is structured is needed in Ohio. Are we driving a Cadillac when we really only need a motorcycle? Or maybe our Ford Taurus just needs a tune-up and an oil change and not a completely different model. We'll find out the answers to these questions. But at the same time, we must also pursue responsible use of our limited resources. And I want to say at this point that the 700-plus judges in the state of Ohio are really doing their very best to function, to keep the doors of the courthouses open with very limited resources and very strained resources. And I want to make that abundantly clear. As part of this initiative, there are other considerations, and those may include the need to examine the structure that we want to keep open, the need to prioritize in order to be efficient and as practical as possible, the need to make technological advances. Oftentimes, limited resources limit the technological advances that can be utilized that in the long term will become very cost effective. Where and when court consolidation should be considered? Does the 1968 Modern Courts Amendment need to be revised? And is there a role for the ongoing Constitutional Modernization Commission to play in this entire view? Everything should be on the table, and I'm a firm advocate of that. No reluctance should exist to do whatever is necessary to preserve access to the courts throughout our state. I believe the time is right to find a solution to the sometimes contentious problems that we are confronted with. Bill also recognizes the need, which is why he made solving court funding his #1 issue and priority during his term as president of the ABA. He sees that overcoming the lack of court funding as an access to justice problem, and I could not agree more. We should borrow some of the great ideas that the ABA and other states have come up with. For instance, what solutions and reforms have been implemented, and how can we bring those to the state of Ohio? How have states mitigated the impact of severe funding cuts in their courts? Believe it or not, there are some states that are in worse shape than Ohio, and they have come up with solutions themselves, and we will be looking at those solutions and see how they fit the Ohio model. We are not alone in our struggling with funds. 42 states cut their state court budget in 2011, reducing access to justice for millions of Americans through layoffs, reduced court hours, and other money-saving measures. The ABA Task Force on Preservation of the Justice System studied the problem for more than a year and delivered an update at the ABA mid-year meeting earlier this year. As Ohio's task force has uncovered, it's not just a state problem either. Local courts rely on local funding to keep the doors open, to keep the lights on, for staffing, for salaries, for programming. It is very much a local problem too. We've avoided furloughs at the Supreme Court, and I recommend avoiding furloughs at local courts too. We have to keep the doors open. We will have to be accessible. We can't curtail the hours because citizens need to have access to our courts. We cannot limit everyday access to justice. We cannot inconvenience Ohio citizens by closing the doors or restricting our hours. But the choices local courts have made in the face of reduced funding is certainly not simple. For more than 3 years, the Morrow County Municipal Court has operated for 4 days a week instead of 5 because of budget cuts. However, the court works 10-hour days, Monday through Thursday, in an attempt to comply with the Ohio Courts Workdays statute. Around the time it decides to close its doors on Fridays, the court made an announcement that it would stop accepting new case filings. The reason? They didn't have enough paper. At the time, Judge Lee McClellan told the dispatch that the court had just enough paper to handle hearing notices and other documents for pending cases, but not new ones. The moratorium on new filings was limited to just civil cases unless the plaintiff brought their own paper. The criminal division was not to be interrupted if at all possible. The situation was resolved as citizens and businesses donated their excess paper to see the court through the end of the year's court budget. While it's hard to say how many Morrow County citizens came face to face with, quote, justice delayed is justice denied, Judge McClellan was clear about the impact of less funding on his staff. He noted that his employees have not received a decent raise in 3 to 5 years and would ironically qualify for court-appointed counsel if they themselves would have been charged with a crime. With these difficulties in mind, Ohio's court funding panel will continue its work and upon completion of that work, issue a final report with specific recommendations for further cost savings and efficiencies which will be considered by the entire court. The task force will meet on a fairly regular basis with its next meeting on September 21st. I have pledged my support and that of the Supreme Court to ensure that the task force answers these critical questions and finds adequate solutions to this pressing problem. I thank you for your interest. Your attention here and your attendance at the lunch indicates to me that you're concerned with this problem, as am I and so many others. And I will now turn the discussion over to Bill for the national perspective. Thank you very much.
Bill, before you get up here, I'll finish my job. Our next speaker is just completed his term as president of the ABA. He is my colleague and a member in charge at our Northern Kentucky offices of Frost Brown Todd. Please welcome Bill Robinson.
Thank you very much, Emmett. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today with the Chief Justice of Ohio. As the Chief Justice indicated, in the past year as president of the American Bar Association, I devoted a major part of my time, energy, and resources to this critical national issue of court underfunding, a crisis that none of us in our lifetime would have expected to occur here in this great country, in this great state. The day that I gave my farewell remarks to the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association in Chicago, Monday a week ago, August the 6th, that day the courts of Kentucky, the entire court system, was shut down for lack of funding. As the Chief Justice says, 42 states last year cut court funding. There is not a state, according to the National Center for State Courts, there's not a state in this country that funds its court system with more than 4.5% of its annual operating budget. The great state of Georgia, the Chief Justice told us last year that last year the state of Georgia funded its state court system with 0.78% of its annual operating budget, and that included the entire prosecutorial system and personnel for the state of Georgia. This situation is beyond anything we could have ever imagined, but it's the reality with which we are dealing in contemporary American society. California is the poster child of this issue, I guess, because in the last 4 to 5 years, California has cut $1.2 billion out of its state court budget. And courthouses, courtrooms are being closed all over California. Layoffs are happening in most of the large metropolitan areas, including San Francisco, where this past fall, 40% of the court personnel were laid off. It is a crisis situation out there, and it is a crisis not just for lawyers, it is a crisis for the citizens of this country. New York, when Governor Cuomo came in early in 2011 as the new governor there, the first thing his administration did, one of the very first things, was to cut $170 million out of the state budget there. $170 million out of the state budget where the trial judges in New York had not received an increase in compensation, not even a COLA, cost of living increase, in 12 years. Judges retiring, resigning at record rates. This situation cries out for the response of citizens to stand up and speak out for our courts. We have been blessed in this country with a unique constitutional representative government that when I use the term unique, it is unique in the history of the world. It is that constitutional representative democracy that has afforded us the quality of life that we have throughout the United States today, and it is now in jeopardy. The historians tell us that when the founders of our country faced the challenges of starting these United States, back in the very beginning, they had a situation where no money for roads, No money for utilities, of course. Historians tell us that many of the revolutionary soldiers who won our freedom went back to the fields never being paid, storefronts being rented to hold government meetings in the beginning. But in those most dire of financial circumstances, the founders of our country wisely wrote a constitution, our constitution, which provides for 3 co-equal branches of government, one of which, of course, is the court system, which has so well served our citizenry generation after generation from the very beginning. We now have inherited this court system, and unfortunately, like education in this country and so many other legacies that have been passed down to us, we now see this treasure slipping through our hands as a society in the United States. Many of us, I think, tend to think of the courts as something that, the family down the street with the teenage child who got into trouble, they need the courts. Somebody, a distant relative with a drug problem in the family, maybe they need the courts. That small business on the other side of town, they need the courts. The fact of the matter is there are over 100 million cases a year filed in this country, and over 95% of those are filed in our state courts. I'm confident in saying this, that this year in Ohio, more cases will be filed this year than in the entire federal court system in the United States. That's how many cases are filed in our highly populated states throughout this country. We're talking about where justice is delivered and accessed on a daily basis by most of our citizenry. And the challenge for us is to awaken our citizenry to the reality with which we're trying to deal. When I approached the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to partner with the American Bar Association on this issue, Tom Donahue and Lisa Ricard reacted immediately and positively by saying they would work with us, they would support us, and they have. We have published the American Bar Association, some of it in cooperation with the U.S. Chamber, over 50 articles, letters to the editor, and op-eds all over the United States. But we're a long way from making progress on this critical issue. As the Chief Justice said, it is a complex issue, and the actual facts upon which to base decision-making going forward are not collected, correlated, and available for analysis in many of our states, just as the situation is here in Ohio. And I want to recognize and pay tribute to the Chief Justice, one of the outstanding Chief Justices in America, for her initiative in taking the leadership to pull together this task force to get to work and get the facts on the table as a basis for more informed decision-making going forward. The problem in our state legislators is that they keep looking at the courts as if the courts were another agency of government, another budget line like roads and parks and so on, all of which are important, but they're not co-equal branches of government. We're talking about the essence of our freedom as Americans, something very special and something which characterizes this wonderful society that has benefited all of us and hopefully will benefit our children and our grandchildren. The American Bar Association has been working very hard on this for 2 years. As the Chief Justice indicated, we've had a task force all over this country conducting hearings, collecting data, developing solutions, approaches to improve the situation. And my predecessor as ABA President, Steve Zack, and I have agreed to co-chair this effort going forward in the coming year to make sure that we keep the public spotlight on the critical significance of this issue and the need for reform, and not reform years from now, reform in the immediate future. Why has this happened? How could it get this way, even in the face of tough economic times? Our studies indicate that a lot of it has to do with the fact that civics education hasn't been a required course in this country for a generation and a half or 2 years. As you might expect, as a national association, the largest voluntary professional association in the world, the ABA regularly does national surveys and conducts polls to get the public view of issues critical to our profession and access to justice. And the sad part is, for instance, a Newsweek magazine polled Americans recently using the U.S. citizenship test. Almost 40% of those Americans tested failed the test. And yes, Americans did very poorly on the questions related to law and our legal system. Another survey indicated that an embarrassingly high number of Americans can name every judge on American Idol, first and last name, but can't name a single judge on the U.S. Supreme Court, including Chief Justice Roberts. This is a sad situation because the general populace doesn't understand the role of the courts, the significance of the courts, the critical position of the courts in balancing our representative democracy to assure access to justice and the rule of law, which is so essential to our ongoing society. Ours is a unique representative democracy, the most unique in the history of the world so far. This democracy is rooted in a constitution which, as I said, identifies the courts of one of three co-equal branches of government. We know from our historians, from our studies, we know that an adequately funded, independent judiciary is the key to constitutional democracy. And we know that constitutional democracy is the key to freedom. For over 200 years in this country, men and women have sacrificed for this constitutional democracy to protect this freedom that has been handed down to us. Now it's our responsibility to decide what we're going to do to assure that we have that same freedom, that same constitutional democracy, the same adequately funded courts to pass on to our children and our grandchildren. Our theme in the ABA this past year has been no courts, no justice, no freedom. That's just how basic this issue really is, and I hope all of you will take it upon yourselves, leaving this meeting and going back into your part of our world with all the challenges and other responsibilities that you have, to write a letter to your legislator, write letters to the editor, author op-eds, talk to your fellow citizens. We need people to start focusing on this and paying more attention to it, or we're going to lose something that's very precious, something that is the essence of our way of life, our constitutional representative democracy, which is the key to freedom. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much, Chief Justice, and thank you, Bill. Appreciate those comments. As always, the Metropolitan Club leaves time for questions from the audience, and so CMC, as you know, also records all its forums for televised broadcasts on ONN, streaming on CMC's website and the Columbus Metropolitan Library website, so there's ample time to see these elsewhere. I would like to ask you, if you have a question, to please come up to the microphone. I see Bill has already done that. Introduce yourself and ask your question. And we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. We want questions to have our two distinguished speakers to answer. And being here at the podium, I'm sorry, Bill, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and ask the first question. And really, it goes along the lines, Bill, what you were saying at the end, and Chief Justice, with respect to your remarks on getting your hands around how the courts are funded, where those funds are come from, and what is the amount. And also, Bill, I was completely unaware I guess my child isn't in school yet. I didn't know that the civics courses weren't being taught already. But you know, our country was founded on the three branches of government, three equal branches, as both the speakers have said. But how do we find ourselves at this position where the funding for the courts becomes more of a line item as opposed to an equal item with the other branches? Where do we get that information? I know, Chief Justice, you're working on that, but where do we get that information? Is there an ability to make it the top of the line item as opposed to however many different funding sources that you can't get a handle on it? I mean, how did it get to that situation, and how do we fix it, I guess, is the first question. I know that's a broad one, but is there a fix? Is it legislative, or is it court-inspired through your task force, or is it, as Bill said, people standing up and writing the legislature? I imagine it's all three, but I'll let you answer.
Well, this is an interesting concept in Ohio that is different than, you know, some of the other states. We're not a unified court system in Ohio. So we don't, like, for example, California or New York, have one funding source for the courts, and all of those dollars come from the state and then are funneled down through the Supreme Court and then disseminated to the local courts. We have you know, just a mixed bag of funding because we're a decentralized form of our judiciary, our court system here in the state of Ohio. We place the burden for the maintenance of the courts on local counties and municipalities, and the Supreme Court is responsible for the salaries of members of the judiciary, but the rest of the overhead, so to speak, is a local responsibility. We're a home rule state. We focus so often and so much of our you know, our legislation and the way we govern ourselves on home rule, and the court system is no different. So we don't have a unified court system, so therefore if you've got home rule and you have the responsibility on the local level, you have the responsibility for funding on the local level. We have 88 different counties, and I don't know how many different municipalities in the state that all have a role to play in the funding of their judiciary. So that's you know, sets the stage for the complications that are present. And I don't, at this point, envision that we're going to go to a unified court system. I'm not advocating for a unified court system because that has so many other issues with it as well, and I don't think it would be very appealing to the citizens of Ohio. So initially, just getting our you know, arms around how much money is spent in toto on the courts in Ohio, where those funding sources are, and how can we better maybe retool the source as well as the utilization. How do we use those resources? Are there better ways to use those resources? Are there things that have not, because quite frankly, this is a new problem for the state, for the judiciary. This is a new problem along with other branches of government. Everything was going along at maintaining, you know, your head above water, and then the recession has brought this to a head, and so that's the challenge. And I believe that we can meet that challenge. I am very confident that this task force will come up with great recommendations, and then we will be able to hopefully implement those recommendations. But keep in mind, going back to the state being a home rule state, it will be important to convince the locals on the value of some of the recommendations that are being brought forth and how they would work. There is a reluctance sometimes to you know, consolidate and to streamline and to pool resources on the local level. The word regionalization is becoming more tolerable, but not in all circles. And that's going to be, you know, you've got to make your case. Any change you ever want to make, you've got to make the case to the people. You have to respect the will of the people, and you have to go forward.
I would only add that it's a political issue, as you are suggesting, Chief Justice. The legal profession, the judges in the system alone, we cannot make any significant difference regarding this critical situation. The solution is only to be found among the citizenry, the business community, the education community, the human services community, and so on. This is a community issue. This is an issue which will determine the quality of democracy and freedom in this country for generations to come. So the solutions have to come from us as a citizenry. We need to work together, and we need to express our will about what we expect and why we will consider that important when we cast our votes. It's a political issue. These legislators, all the ones I know, are dedicated. They're servants of the government and the people. They want to do the best that they can do, but let's face it, they have limited resources now. They don't have as much as they would like to have, or we would like them to have, to meet all the many worthwhile demands that are made upon them to try to balance the budget and keep the government open and working and so on. The question is prioritizing, elevating the courts to their essential level of being a co-equal branch and providing the checks and balances that assures the highest quality of freedom that we can have in this country and that we have enjoyed for so long. That's the real key. What do we want as a people? What do we want as communities? What is acceptable to us? What will we do without? And what will we not do without when it comes to access to justice, not only for ourselves, but for our fellow citizens?
And I would like to add that as Chief Justice, I have found that working with the legislature and working with the government, that we have a very good working relationship with one another. I feel very comfortable in addressing the issues that present themselves with the court that will be impacted by legislation with talking to the legislative leaders. There is not an impasse there. There's an open door. They feel comfortable calling me and talking about those things as I do with them. So identifying the solution is the hard thing, and I think making our case to reasonable minds, both in the legislature and in the executive branch, can be something that will definitely be received and done. Again, both the legislative and the executive branch in the state are very supportive and open.
Thank you. We'll now open it up to questions from the audience. Please, again, state your name and your question, and limit your comments to just questions.
I sure will. I'm Bill Lafayette. I'm a regional economist, CMC trustee, and owner of Regionomics. And my question is that we're all facing this growing attitude that government bad, tax bad. What you all are talking about is really reallocating a shrinking pie. How much do you think confronting that attitude and augmenting revenue to help pay for the services that we all need, how much of the answer is that?
If I can decipher the question, it's should we raise taxes? I don't know the dollar amount that is in play here. I wish I did, because we'd be, 60% down the road here in finding a solution. So I'm not here telling you that we need to raise taxes or that we need to raise fees, or we do need to find out what the dollar amount that is allocated currently for our systems, are those dollars being used in the most conscientious and responsible way? What are our priorities and how we can reallocate? And once that's done, then the answer to your question will be obvious. And I don't know the answer to your question.
I would only add to that it's a question for us to answer about what we expect, what we value in terms of our courts. That's the real question. It's prioritization. I can't envision when there's going to be a time when there'll be, as there were maybe in the 90s, resources around to distribute comfortably. There's going to be competition for government resources for as long as most of us can see down the road. So unless there's a prioritization, there's no solution. And the only solution that ends up mattering is more funding, because the funding we have now is clearly not adequate for the need of the population for access to justice.
Bill Wagner, the Wagner Machine Works, a figment of my imagination. This is a very serious forum, hence I hesitate to speak. However, I understand, or I've heard, that a little levity now and then is relished by the best of men and women, I hope. I have two questions, one of them for Chief Justice O'Connor and the other one for President Robinson, in reverse order. Squire Robinson. The most egregious decisions of the National Supreme Court, in my estimation recently, is those dealing with the free speech. One of them being the so-called church, members of the so-called church, picketing military funerals. And I cannot see how that is tolerated, number one. That's number one. The other one is this...
Sir, if you have a question, that'd be great.
Oh, yeah, well, I have
you.
a question. I have a question.
All right.
I have to prepare myself. The other one is this video games for children where money is involved. Now, I cannot see how it is equated or in the same equivalence class of a 5-minute roasting of a witch and the burning of a Joan of Arc every nanosecond. My question is, what do you think of my idea that in the latter case, video games be installed in the water closets of the respective judges who affirmed that decision?
I'm not sure that's a question that our panelists can ask, but let me ask another question. The recent crisis that we had, the economic crisis over the last 4 or 5 years, has that been one of the instruments that have exposed this issue, or is it a primary cause of the issue?
That's a good question. It's almost like the chicken and the egg.
Yes,
so,
right.
I believe that it has exposed it, and it is also, someone just, said recently, you never let a good crisis go, unused or benefited from, and so I'm looking at this. It doesn't necessarily matter whether it's exposed it or it's caused it. The shrinkage of revenue, I think, is undeniable. So what do we do in response? And in the meantime, along the way, if we're relooking at our systems and taking a stock of them, is this a good program that our judiciary has? Are there better systems out there? One of the, a corollary or a collateral system that needs to be examined and has been examined by our legislature is our Department of Corrections. Obviously the connection between the courts and the Department of Corrections and the sentencing of people to our institutions, and relooking at that, and is that a wise use of our dollars, or are there alternatives that are there, probationary alternatives that are less costly, and therefore the Department of Corrections doesn't need the volume of dollars that it may have in the past to keep in operation. Those are great opportunities. I look at all of this as an opportunity. It's a challenge, but it is an opportunity to improve our systems and improve our delivery of services, and thereby improve the lives of our citizens. I think that's extremely important. Citizens may not know that their lives need to be improved by an enhancement of our judicial system, because I agree 100% with Bill's comments that the lack of education that our citizens for the last generation or two have experienced with regards to the importance of the courts. When you think about it, how are information about the courts delivered to the average person under 25 years of age or so right now? Entertainment on television. Look how our courts are portrayed on television. You know, judges are either curmudgeons or buffoons or afternoon, you know, the kids come home from school and they watch those afternoon judge shows, which couldn't be further from the truth. They're actually an insult to intelligence, and yet that's what people believe our judges are like. If you look at the evening shows, they're even worse in their portrayal of the judiciary and the lawyers of this country. It's not a good picture. And I really think it is a challenge of our educational system and a challenge to the bench and the bar to disabuse citizens of this country of those images and tell them what courts are really like. Judges need to be out there talking to community groups and explaining what they do for a living and how important it is. And lawyers need to be out there talking to community groups as well, going into schools, being part of the educational system. I think that would go a long way for people to understand why funding crises is such a crisis and how we need to resolve it.
I concur completely that this is very much an opportunity and needs to be seen as an opportunity because these are the cards that are dealt now. I mean, this is what we are facing, whether we like it or not, whether we would have preferred to be in the situation we're in. We're here now. So the question is for us as a citizenry, what are we going to do about it? See it as an opportunity and use that to get across to our legislators the need to prioritize for more adequate funding for our courts. That's really the only solution that's going to be meaningful statewide, nationwide, for the foreseeable future. We just need that additional funding because we're down to the bone marrow in terms of cutting and efficiencies and technology being more and more antiquated and new and needed programs going unfulfilled because the resources just aren't there. There aren't many solutions left that don't involve the need for additional funding. So that's what we're focusing on at this time.
Thank you very much. I'm Jane Scott. I guess my question is maybe a little complicated, but you know, we all hear, as you say, the stereotypes, which I'm sure are stereotypes. But on the other hand, we also understand that we live in a litigious society. And I'm very thankful that I have had very little use of the court, as I think probably most of us in this room are very thankful that we don't get to see the inside of a courtroom very often. My question really is how much can be saved from actually going to court by a system of mediation, arbitration, and is that one of the solutions that's being considered as a possibility and a lower cost than actually taking court time and court resources?
That, I think, is a very astute observation, and it is true that alternative dispute resolution, just collectively using that term to mean mediation as well as arbitration and other forms of dispute resolution, are extremely important. It's a major component here that I think is part of the analysis, a very important part. There are courts and private entities across the state and across the country that do engage in alternative dispute resolution, and the participants find it to be extremely satisfying. And it circumvents the cost of litigation, it circumvents the length of litigation, and I think that there's a definite place for that. And I'm a very big proponent for alternative dispute resolution because, you know, we have to be creative, not one size fits all. And if it is the type of program or type of problem that is being presented between the parties, especially parties that are going to have an ongoing relationship, and I look to domestic relations with children, and I look to other types of even business environment, that it's so important to not, you know, win the war and just decimate the parties. I just think that's an unfortunate outcome of some of our court activities. So I'm a big proponent.
I don't know the current statistics in Ohio for the percentage of cases resolved by one form or another of alternative dispute resolution, but it's a substantial percentage. And in fact, across the country, if a high percentage of cases weren't resolved through alternative dispute resolution, the entire system would simply collapse. There's no way that every case could go to trial. I mean, the system, the courthouse space, the availability of juries, the lack of juror fees, et cetera, would just result in the whole system collapsing. But to give you and our viewers some insight as to where this is going if we don't turn the situation around, 2 weeks ago I was in the chambers of the Chief Justice of California meeting with lawyers from all over the state talking about this issue and its impact there. And what is happening there, among other things, to try to deal with the lack of funding from the state is a fee system for using the court system. So that, now think of the impact of this on small business, which is the backbone of our economy in this country. All the politicians are telling us this on both sides of the aisle during this election season. We know it to be a fact. Small business is the largest creator of jobs in this country when we need jobs. And in California, to file a complex civil lawsuit, there's an extra premium to filing that of $1,000. And then when one party files a motion or a pleading, there's a fee for that. And then when the other parties respond, they have to file an additional fee. So it gets to look a lot like pay to play every step of the way. Well, what happens to access to justice to small business and the citizenry when faced with those kinds of costly solutions to lack of adequate court funding? I hope we're a long way away from that here, but that's the direction in which it's going when the cuts become even more severe and the funding becomes even less adequate. So I assure you it's something all of us need to be concerned about.
Sir, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Scott Pooch, and my question's along the same line as Jane's. If you could just comment, because I'm completely ignorant on it, what the trend line and the volume of cases over, say, the last 10 years has been, and if you follow that trend line out, how does that interplay with this current issue?
Actually, that's a question I spoke about yesterday with a reporter from the Plain Dealer. About a month ago, we issued a study that indicates that we are an all-time low as far as cases filings in the state of Ohio. We're reduced traffic cases as well as civil filings, and he was asking me, why is that? I don't know. I don't know what we keep the numbers, and people can delve into the particulars of why. For example, traffic cases are down, traffic citations are down. Now, is that because people are driving more safely? I would like to think so, and that our roads are better, better places to find yourself these days. Or is it the impact, there's less police on the street that, are on traffic detail and then catching speeders? I don't know the answer to that. But somebody can look at those figures and figure that out. But I can tell you that in the tracking for the last 10 years, we are reduced in the number of cases that have been filed from municipal court all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, of course, gets our cases on appeal from the trial courts through the appellate courts to the Supreme Court, so it's only logical that we would have less cases, not significantly, it's not like we don't have anything to do, I don't want you to get that impression, or the appellate courts, because those cases originate in the trial level, which is the municipal and the county. Juvenile traffic cases are down. One could speculate that kids don't have enough money to put gas in the tank of the car, so therefore they're driving less. And if that's the case, they don't have access to cars, and they're safer drivers. Is it an issue of safer drivers because of education, mandatory education? I don't know. But we are at a lower number, or maybe people just can't afford court filing fees, which is another indication of why we might be down with regards to our civil cases.
Well, thank you very much for those responses and the questions. Mr. Robinson, let me ask you one last question. The Kentucky court system, is it back up and running?
It is back up and running. It will be closed 3 full days this year because of lack of court funding. We've had 45% in budget cuts to our state courts just since 2009, and we were hit again this year with another multi-million-dollar cut to the system as a whole. So it's not a good situation, and the prospects for the foreseeable future are not encouraging.
States around the country all experiencing the same exact type of issue?
There are very few states where the situation is looking much brighter. Delaware, I'm told, is doing well. A lot of businesses there funding the system through the state. The Dakotas are doing well, I read, because of natural gas. They're talking about eliminating their income tax statewide. They're doing very well. But Utah seems to have a stable situation right now, not flush, just stable, not seeing cuts, additional cuts coming for a while. But overall, the situation nationally is very dire.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank both of you, and please, everyone, provide a round of applause. Before we leave today, please remember to make reservations for our next forum with John P. McConnell next Wednesday, and the CMC Summer Celebration on August 29th. And I want to continue to invite all of you for coffee and cookies out in the lobby after this. And one more time, let's thank our sponsor today, Frost Brown Todd, and our Chief Justice, Maureen O'Connor, and Mr. Bill Robinson. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for being here.